You've thought about it, maybe more than once. You've sat with a friend as they flipped through reference images, watched them commit, watched them walk out changed. And something in you observed all of that carefully, quietly, and then walked away, still blank. It's not that you hate tattoos. You don't. Some of them are stunning. Some feel like poetry pressed into skin. But when it comes to your own body, something stops you. Not fear, exactly. Not judgment. Something quieter and harder to name. And here's the part that probably surprises even you, that hesitation. It doesn't come from emptiness. It comes from somewhere much more complex than most people realize. If you've never gotten a tattoo, and you've never quite been able to explain why, this isn't about needles. It isn't about pain tolerance. It isn't even about style. It's about how your mind experiences identity itself. And you are not broken. You are not boring. You are not lacking in self-expression. Your brain is doing something deeply intelligent, and most psychology has never given it the credit it deserves. There's a particular kind of person who, when presented with a beautiful, meaningful tattoo idea, feels genuinely excited for about 48 hours. They imagine it. They picture where it would go. They let it live in their mind like a draft they haven't committed to paper yet. And then something shifts. The excitement doesn't disappear. It transforms into a question, a very specific question that keeps returning no matter how hard they push it away. What if I change? Psychologists have a name for the cognitive process underneath that question. They call it future self continuity, the degree to which a person mentally identifies with who they will become. Most people think about their future self in abstract terms, but some people experience it almost viscerally. They simulate future regret with unusual clarity. They don't just wonder if they'll regret something, they times it in advance, like a warning their nervous system sends before the decision is made. Think of it like a simulation running in the background of every major choice. Most people have this, but for certain minds, the simulation is louder, more detailed, more persistent. And a tattoo, a permanent, unchangeable mark, triggers that simulation immediately. Not because they're afraid of commitment, but because they are acutely, almost painfully aware that they keep evolving. The person you are at 22 may not be the person you want represented at 42. That sentence lands differently depending on how you experience identity. For some people, identity feels like a fixed point, a core self that stays stable even as circumstances change. Tattoos make perfect sense to that kind of mind. You know who you are. You want the world to know it too. But for others, identity feels more like a current than a location, always moving, always deepening, never quite settled into a final form. Psychologists sometimes describe this as identity flexibility, a psychological orientation that prioritizes openness over definition. People with high identity flexibility are often deeply self-reflective. They hold their own beliefs loosely, not because they lack conviction, but because they trust that their understanding will keep expanding. To that kind of mind, a tattoo doesn't feel like self-expression. It feels like self-arrest, like being asked to take a photograph of yourself mid-sentence and frame it permanently on the wall. For some minds, permanence doesn't feel romantic. It feels psychologically claustrophobic. But here's the part nobody tells you about. The discomfort isn't just about the future. It's also about what the tattoo would have to times mean. There's a quiet but powerful psychology at work in people who never get tattoos, something that runs counter to nearly everything modern culture tells us about identity. Modern culture insists, show yourself, brand yourself, express yourself loudly, publicly, permanently. Make your inner world visible so others can confirm it exists. But some people carry a fundamentally different relationship to meaning. They feel sometimes, without even being able to articulate it, that if something matters deeply enough, it doesn't need to be displayed. It can live entirely inside them, weightless and private, unwitnessed and unverified. Psychologists sometimes call this internal locus of meaning, a preference for locating the significance of experience within the self rather than in external validation. It's not suppression. It's not fear of being seen. It's a genuine psychological comfort with invisible depth. There's something quietly radical about that in a culture built on performance. These aren't people who have nothing to say. They're people who've decided that some things don't need to be said out loud. This shows up in other areas of their lives too. They're often the ones who don't post every milestone on social media, who keep certain relationships intensely private, who feel a strange resistance to turning meaningful experiences into content, who process grief or joy internally before ever naming it publicly. It's not coldness. It's a specific kind of intimacy with themselves. Think of it like this. For some people, the inside of their inner world is the most precious real estate they have. The things that live there are more times meaningful because they aren't on display, not less. Sharing them publicly wouldn't amplify them. It would somehow reduce them. The tattoo, in that context, isn't a celebration of identity. It's a category error. And this is where it gets interesting, because the relationship to permanence changes across a lifetime. At 25, the hesitation might feel like uncertainty, like you just haven't found the time's design yet, the one that finally feels right. You keep waiting for something permanent enough to deserve permanence. At 35, the hesitation often shifts into clarity. You've watched yourself change too dramatically to believe any single image could hold all of you. The resistance stops feeling like indecision and starts feeling like self-knowledge. At 45, something else entirely happens. The permanence discomfort might soften not because you've finally committed to a version of yourself, but because you've made peace with the fact that you never will. Some people get their first tattoo late, not despite their psychological complexity, but because of it. By then, they understand that the tattoo doesn't have to capture everything. It's a moment, a marker, and they can carry it without it defining them. The behavior doesn't disappear, it evolves. The psychology underneath deepens. What's really happening underneath all of this is emotional regulation. The decision to remain unmarked, however, unconscious functions like an anchor. It keeps a particular kind of person tethered to a sense of possibility. Options feel like oxygen to certain minds. Not because they can't commit, but because commitment to one path means closing others, and some nervous systems experience that closing as a kind of quiet grief. Keeping the skin blank isn't avoidance, it's preservation of flexibility, of future versions of the self that haven't arrived yet, but feel real already. It's like keeping a door open in a house you've lived in so long you've forgotten the door is there. You're not planning to leave, you just need to know you could. That open door is a regulation strategy. It tells the nervous system, you are not trapped, you are not frozen, you are still becoming. And for a mind that experiences identity as fluid, that message is essential. Maybe the psychology of people who never get tattoos isn't about fear at all. Maybe it isn't about conservatism or indecision or a lack of something to say. Maybe it's about how certain minds hold themselves lightly, carefully, with enormous respect for the person they haven't yet become. Some people don't avoid tattoos because they lack identity. They avoid them because their identity never stops evolving. And there's nothing to fix in that. There's nothing to overcome. There's only the quiet, complex, deeply human experience of a mind that refuses to be finished. You don't need a reason that makes sense to anyone else. You never did.